Hello viewers, and welcome to a very special Saturday episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has been the capital of these United States since the year 1800. Prior to that year, the capital was located in Philadelphia. I also learned recently that the Washington Monument is actually two different colors. It's because when they began construction, they ran out of funding about halfway through, and then when the project resumed later, they used a different kind of stone to build the top half. I also found it interesting how much residents of DC love their wine. In fact, people living in Washington, DC drink more wine than people living in any of the 50 states per capita. The city has approximately 700,000 residents according to recent estimates, and that is in fact more people than the entire state of Wyoming and the entire state of Vermont as well. The district also pays more in federal taxes than about 22 US states. As recently as 1961, residents of DC could not vote in presidential elections, and they only have that right today because of the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution. And to this day, Washington, D.C. has no representation in the U.S. House of Representatives or the Senate because it is technically not a state. As you can imagine, citizens of the capital feel shortchanged by this. I mean, the fact that they pay so much in taxes relative to a bunch of other states and then they don't have any representation in Congress could get frustrating for a lot of people. If you travel to DC and look at their license plates, you'll even see the subtitle at the bottom, "Taxation Without Representation." There is some news on that front though regarding statehood for DC. As recently as June 26th of this year, 2020, the US House, for the first time in DC's 230-year history, voted to declare Washington, D.C. as the 51st state of the Union. Of course, this also has to pass the U.S. Senate and have the approval of the president. And with Mitch McConnell as the Senate Majority Leader and President Trump as the current president of the White House, it is highly unlikely that we will see a 51st star on our flag anytime soon. So that may naturally lead you to the question, okay, why are Democrats so heavily in favor of DC statehood while Republicans are so heavily against it? To get a better understanding of that, let's take a look at a new kind of graph that we have not seen yet in this series. Let's pull that up right now. So because Washington, D.C. has no representation in the U.S. House, I can't do my usual thing of showing you raw House turnout numbers. What I can show you instead is the percentage of the vote received by each presidential candidate going back for the last 20 years. And I think a double bar graph is actually the best way to illustrate this because it shows you just how heavily Democrat the state of the District of Columbia is. Democrats' absolute lowest point in Washington, D.C. during the 21st century was in 2000, but Al Gore, the Democratic presidential candidate that year, still received over 85% of the vote of D.C.'s residents, whereas George W. Bush, who would later go on to win the presidency, didn't even crack 10%. Ever since the 23rd Amendment was ratified, Washington, D.C. has only voted for Democratic presidential candidates, and by huge margins like this. What's also interesting to note about this city, though, is that the population of Washington, D.C. is about 45% African American, which is almost 10% higher proportion than the state with the largest per capita African American population, that being Mississippi. DC residents naturally feel underrepresented in Congress because they have no Congress people, but they always show up big for Democrats every 4 years, as we can see from this graph. Okay, let's toss that aside, and obviously I can't do my normal calculations this time, so I'm just going to do something a little different. I'm just going to estimate a slope value going back over the last 20 years to estimate what percentage of the vote Joe Biden will receive and Donald Trump will receive this November. And when we do draw that line, we, hey Polbot, what's the voter difference between Trump and Biden this November? Woo! All right, 89.7% difference of vote between Joe Biden and Donald Trump this November. That is enormous. That's actually the biggest margin we've seen so far in the 21st century. With a margin like that, we can estimate that Biden will receive 93.4% of the DC vote and Trump will receive about 3.7. It's certainly no shock to me anyway that Washington, D.C. is going to go heavily Democratic, but I must admit, even I didn't necessarily see it going this heavily Democratic. I mean, Donald Trump not even receiving 5% of the vote is pretty major. So with that result in, we have 3 more Electoral College votes going for Joe Biden. Let's make that official and put it on our presidential map. Mark it. So the presidential election results are in for the District of Columbia. Let's talk briefly about the area's future. Like I said earlier, in order for DC to possibly become the 51st state of the country, a bunch of people would have to be on board, including a majority of the residents of the District of Columbia, which isn't really a problem because most of them feel underrepresented at this point anyway. They would also need the support of the majority of the U.S. House of Representatives, which they have at this point with a Democratic majority in the House. Where the fight for DC statehood falls short right now is in the Senate and the presidency, of course. Mitch McConnell isn't even bringing the resolution to a vote on the Senate floor as long as he's the Senate Majority Leader, guaranteed. Because DC statehood would mean increasing the total amount of senators in the country from 100 to 102, and those extra 2 would most assuredly be Democrats because of what we know about how DC residents vote for presidents. So anything that threatens Mitch McConnell's majority in his eyes is not worthy of consideration by the U.S. Senate. And obviously the president would have to be involved too, and the idea of any more Democrats representing any part of this country in any capacity in Congress is an idea that is appalling to the current resident of the White House. So the only possible way this moves forward is if there is a clean sweep for Democrats this November, which remains to be seen. Obviously. If that does in fact happen, do not expect DC residents to stay quiet about their fight for statehood. It's been an ongoing battle for decades for them. They had a major victory in the early 60s when they got to vote for presidents, but it does not stop there. And that just about does it for this latest very special Saturday episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday regularly. I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date, so if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter. That link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, thank you for voting, and I'll see you next time.